I'm sure you can appreciate. We can't discuss.
Well, I know that's always your
personnel
excuse.
matters.
No, I got it. I understand how you remain above the law by using that excuse repeatedly. The reason I'm a little sensitive on August 2020 is that on August 6th, both Senator Grassley and I received an unsolicited briefing by members of the FBI, which I knew immediately was a setup. No new information whatsoever. I knew it was a setup, and I was correct because 9 months later, on May 1st, it was leaked to the Washington Post to smear me. I have written you publicly a number of times asking who directed that briefing. Are you prepared to tell me in public who directed that briefing now?
Senator, first off, I can't discuss specific defensive briefings more broadly, and that's a longstanding practice.
So tell me then, why have you refused to meet with us to privately tell us who directed that briefing?
So, if I may finish my answer to the question. It's longstanding practice not to discuss specific defensive briefings. We have, as my understanding, responded in writing to a letter that you sent. I think
it's bureaucratic gobbledygook is what that is. That's not a response.
We offered in that letter to provide a senior executive of the FBI to walk through in detail our process.
What your process is, but not specifically who directed a briefing that was used to smear me. Have you looked into the leaking of that briefing to the Washington Post? Have you investigated that?
I'm not going to discuss specific investigations. As to the briefing question and who directs it, let me be very clear about this. When it comes to election-related defensive briefings, there is not a single person who makes that decision. That is an interagency process that was set up by the prior administration, signed off on by the former president, by the Office of the Director of National Intelligence.
There are persons in that interagency, correct? So there would be persons. So we should know who those persons are. Why won't you tell us who directed that briefing, the persons then?
I would refer you to the process that was put in place, and we can give you more information about the process if you would like.
Have you read Senator Grassley's and my report on Hunter Biden's corruption issued in September of 2020 and November of 2020? Have you read those reports?
I have had a chance to look at it.
Do you see any sign of Russian disinformation in those reports?
That would be a hard question for me to answer.
No, it's very easy. It's very easy.
What I would say
it's a very easy answer. There is no Russian disinformation. That report is completely clean of any interference of foreign influence, although we have been falsely accused, including by the chairman of this committee, of spreading Russian disinformation. Are you aware of the FBI having any involvement whatsoever in the October 19, 2020 public statement by 51 former intelligence officials?
I'm not aware of any involvement by the FBI in what you're describing.
The reason I ask is, if it's true that in August of 2020, the FBI initiated a scheme to downplay derogatory information on Hunter Biden, it would seem like maybe part of that scheme would be to get intelligence officials to issue a letter that stated that the laptop had all the earmarks of a Russian information operation. That was totally false. We now know that the Hunter laptop is completely authentic. The point I'm trying to make here is the unsolicited briefing that was leaked in May of 2021 was used to smear me and interfered into the U.S. Senate election of November 2022. One of the whistleblowers to my committee has stated that the FBI was no longer going to interfere in the election, something to that effect. I can't find it right now, and I'm running out of time. Oh, here it is. The FBI is, quote, not going to change the outcome of the election again. Well, the FBI certainly tried to by leaking, or somebody leaked that FBI briefing. Are you going to investigate that? because that is the election interference. And let's face it, this letter by 51 intelligence officials, this interfered in the 2020 election to a far greater extent than anything Russia or China ever could have hoped to accomplish. You have to acknowledge that. It has to be investigated. I have no faith that you will do so.
Senator Hassan, you are recognized for your questions.
Well, thank you, Chair Peters, and I want to thank you and Ranking Member Portman for holding this hearing today. Thank you to our witnesses for being here, and I want to add my prayers and thoughts for the CBP officers, the officer who was fatally wounded and those who are gravely wounded, and to their families. I think it's fair to say that the people of New Hampshire and the United States are holding these brave men and women in our prayers. I also wanted to take the opportunity, although he has stepped out for a moment, just to thank Ranking Member Portman for his years of service and for his work on this committee and for the bipartisan work that he has led. And again, to all of the witnesses, but more importantly to the men and women you lead, thank you, to them, their families. The first priority of government is to ensure the safety and security of its citizens, and your work is really critical to that mission. Director Abizaid, I want to start with a question to you and then a follow-up to the other two witnesses. When we held this hearing a year ago, some assessments indicated that in the wake of the United States withdrawal from Afghanistan, al-Qaeda would have the ability to reconstitute itself and threaten the United States homeland within 1 to 2 years. Here we are 1 year later. To the extent that you can discuss it in an unclassified setting, what is the National Counterterrorism Center's assessment of al-Qaeda's capability to threaten the U.S. homeland?
Thank you very much for the question. Al-Qaeda's capability to threaten the United States homeland from Afghanistan is quite limited, in part thanks to the operation that killed Ayman al-Zawahiri in Kabul here recently, but also because the al-Qaeda elements that are still present in Afghanistan are really not focused on external operations as far as we can tell. There are other terrorist elements in Afghanistan that we are concerned about, primarily ISIS's branch there, ISIS Khorasan. But the threat from al-Qaeda should be disaggregated from that, I think, given the very unique circumstances around that group, its relationship with the Taliban, and some of the specifics in which it has evolved over the years.
Well, thank you. Director Wray and Secretary Mayorkas, do you agree with this assessment, and what are your agencies doing to mitigate the threat? And I'll start with you, Director Wray.
I would add a couple things to what Director Abizaid had to say. One is we're obviously very concerned about ISIS-K
Right.
as one of the threats. Second, I think as time progresses, I am concerned that we will have fewer and fewer good sources of information about what al-Qaeda is or isn't doing in Afghanistan, so we always have to be mindful of, as Secretary Rumsfeld famously said, the known unknown.
Right.
That goes there. And then third, we are very concerned about al-Qaeda and ISIS's ability to inspire attacks even from over there. So those are a few points that I would add.
Thank you. Secretary?
Senator, I think the point that my colleagues have made underscores a broader point, which is that we've spoken about the evolving threats, but we should keep in mind that the threats of the past remain the threats of the present. Only new ones have been added. And so I defer to the experts to my left.
Thank you. Now, Secretary Mayorkas, I want to move on to a different topic. Every week, a new drug seizure along the border makes headlines, but the flow of drugs across the southwest border is unrelenting. The drugs that DHS seizes accounts for just a fraction of the total that criminal organizations attempt to smuggle into our country. What specific steps is DHS taking to stem the flow of drugs crossing the border? And what additional resources are you using to address this problem? What additional resources do you need?
Senator, thank you so much. So it is a fact that the smugglers seek to transport controlled substances, illegal drugs, into the United States, primarily through the ports of entry, through trucks, vehicles, and the like. And what we have done is we have surged technological resources that can most effectively detect the effort to smuggle those dangerous substances into our country. Specifically, for example, non-intrusive inspection technology, which has remarkable X-ray capabilities that can be implemented very, very swiftly. We have deployed forward operating labs so personnel scientists can detect the controlled substances and we can effect the seizure immediately and refer to law enforcement the persons who have sought to smuggle them. What we need is more resources like that, and we really hope that Congress passes our fiscal year 2023 budget. We are already 6 weeks into the new fiscal year.
Right.
Without the resources that we need financially to invest in that technology and deploy additional personnel as well.
Thank you. One additional question, I think, given my time to you, Secretary Mayorkas. Over the last few years, cyber attacks have plagued state and local governments and other public entities. Toward that end, as part of the bipartisan infrastructure laws, Senator Cornyn and I helped create a federal grant program for state and local entities to improve their cybersecurity. The application period for the first year of the grant program concluded just this past Tuesday. I understand that the Department of Homeland Security is still reviewing applications, but can you explain what the department's goals are for this first year of grants and how you intend to achieve them?
We are so grateful for that grant program. It's a multi-billion-dollar grant program over several years. The first year, this first year of its implementation, we are dedicating $185 million in resources to state and local governments. This is all about building their capacity to enhance the security of the cyber ecosystem. In cybersecurity, Senator, we say we are only as strong as our weakest link. And the fact of the matter is that there are target-rich and resource-poor localities that we need to strengthen. Right. And that is what this grant program is going to enable us to do.
So your goal really right now is making sure that the state and local governments that have applied get the resources they need and really focus on strengthening that level of cyber security. Is that fair to say is a priority there?
Yes, it is, Senator.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Hessen. Senator Paul, you're recognized for your questions.
Director Wray, is Facebook or any other social media company supplying private messages or data on American users that is not compelled by the government or the FBI?
Not compelled. In other words, not in response to legal process.
No warrant, no subpoena. They're just supplying you information on their users.
I don't believe so, but I can't sit here and be sure of that as I sit here.
Can you give us a yes or no by going back to your team and asking? Because it's a very specific question, because if they are, it's against the law. The law, the Stored Communications Act, the Electronic Communications Privacy Act of 1986 prohibits providers from sharing electronic communications with any person or entity unless it's compelled. This was done to protect the privacy of people so we could feel like we can send an email or direct message to people without having that information given over. It's a very specific question. Will you get with your team of lawyers and give us a specific answer? Because this is the law. If you're doing it, then we need to go to court to prevent you from receiving this information.
Well, I can tell you that I'm quite confident we're following the law, but what I will also
Well,
do
that's
is
not the
follow up
answer.
with-
That's
but-
not the
But I
answer.
will also follow up with you to make sure that we get you more information, more detailed information.
Is the FBI obtaining anonymous social media data and then using technical methods to pierce the anonymous nature of the data?
Anonymous social media data?
So you purchase data. People purchase data all the time, and we sort of tolerate it for advertising and things because it's anonymous data. Are you purchasing what is said to be anonymous data through the marketplace and then piercing the anonymous nature to attach individual names to that data?
Right. But when you asked about anonymous data, I was thinking more in terms of
No, I'm talking about data that is out there, and are you purchasing data and then piercing the anonymous nature of that data?
so the manner in which we use, we usually use the term commercial data, is probably longer than I could explain here. But again, let me have a
So
one of our subject matter experts follow up with
you will not answer the question of whether or not you're attaching names to anonymous data.
I think it's a more complicated answer than I can give here.
So far, we're 0 for 2 with getting you to answer this, but you're pledging you will actually answer the question, because you have to realize the frustration. We'll write you a letter, and your team of lawyers will write back 15-page letter that says nothing, and you won't answer the question. These are very specific. This is whether you're obeying the law, whether we can have confidence. I want to have confidence in the FBI.
We are obeying the law.
Well, you're saying that, but we won't tell us the answer.
I said
so,
we
so
would-
you have to
no,
say yes.
that's not what
yes,
I
we're- No, you aren't telling me the answer, and the answer is, are you collecting data not compelled by a warrant? That would not be in compliance with the law, but you won't answer that you're not collecting that data.
I said two things. One, we're following the law, and second, that we would have somebody follow up with you with more detailed, specific
So those are two
information.
specific questions. Are you getting data from them that's not compelled? And then are you piercing the anonymous nature of that technically? Are you receiving private messages from social media companies through the use of confidential human sources? From Facebook, social media companies. You have people working over there who you're paying or who are volunteering to give you information, even though it would be against the law for Facebook to do this. But now you're saying, well, we'll get around the law by using confidential human sources.
You mean, just to be clear, I'm following the question, you mean, in effect, recruiting a human source inside the company?
Exactly.
Yeah. No, I don't believe so. I think what we have had situations where we have confidential human sources, not employees of those companies, but who report to us on their own communication.
Okay.
So if the two of us had a communication and Secretary Mayorkas was a human source, he could report to us about what he is saying to me.
Once again, I'd like the answer to be more specific from your team. Not that I don't believe so, but that you are or are not using human confidential resources within Facebook. So we get back to the idea of whether or not you're getting information for them outside the warrant process, because the next question is, which you probably won't answer either, is, are you taking information that you're getting not through the warrant process and then going around and coming back and using that as a predicate for getting a warrant to actually get the information you've already been given?
I'm not sure I'm completely following the...
Basically, you get information that Facebook's volunteering. This has all been written up in the Post article. You're familiar with the Post article with the accusations. And the question is, are you getting information they're giving to you? They say, oh, somebody says January 6th was great. Here's information on this guy. Then you're taking it and then using it as a predicate to say, well, now let's go to the court and get a real warrant and get the information we already actually got without a warrant.
So we get tips and leads from all over the place, from members of the public, from businesses, from community leaders, from other government partners all the time. And we use the tips and leads that we get to often form predicates for law.
Are you getting tips and leads from Facebook and social media companies?
We get tips and leads from companies, absolutely.
Right. It includes private information.
But I'm not aware of us receiving any tips or leads.
Because see, here's the point is, you may think it's just jolly well to get all this stuff without a warrant that people volunteer to you, but many of us are alarmed that you're getting this information that are private communications between people because it is against the law. It's against the law for Facebook or social media companies to give it to you, but it's also against the law for you to receive it. So you're going to have to very specifically go back with your team and search over whether you're doing it, not just say, we're probably not, we obey the law, we're good people. Well, no, there are doubts because this has been reported. Even the FBI, when you responded to the New York Post article, said that companies are referring information to the FBI with investigative value relating to foreign malign influence. Now, there'd probably be a great deal more tolerance about that if it's foreign malign influence, but the question is, are you also receiving information on so-called domestic? But what would that mean? Is someone questioning whether paper ballots are an accurate way of running election? Is that good enough for you to be getting our private information because we have a political beef with the way votes are counted or recorded in our country? Is that something that you're collecting information on? Are they giving you information on private things that you've told them, well, people who question the election, we want to hear about these people, and so then they're giving you this information. Are you receiving information
I'll
like
give
that?
you two classic examples that I think happen with some frequency. One, if we supply information to, say, Facebook or any number of other technology companies about foreign accounts, Russian intelligence service, for example, accounts, when they then look in their system for those accounts, they often find other accounts related to those, and they provide tips and leads back to us about those. That's one example. A second would be a situation where a technology company encounters a threat of violence on their platform on their services, and they provide tips and leads to us, and we
And
follow
there's
up
a-
on those
and
threats of
there's probably
violence.
not a lot of disagreement about that. The question is when we start to talk about political speech. And that is the question, are you receiving things that could be interpreted? And we'd want to know, and if you're not going to admit to us, whether it's political speech, someone who questions the election, someone who is mad about something that is going on, but is not saying they're directly going to commit violence. They're mad about things. What the New York Post article said is, yes, you're getting this. And then when they're finally read in context, and this is from a whistleblower, which makes us suspect you're not being forthcoming or honest with us, is that whistleblowers are saying you are receiving this information from Facebook and others, and that you are going around the Constitution then to come back and try to get warrants for it. But then once you read it, there's been no actionable intelligence on this, but this is an active program that you've got. You work for the government. You should admit to us whether or not you have a program going after our speech.
Thank you, Senator Paul.
We investigate violence, not speech.
Thank you, Senator Paul. Senator Langford, you're recognized for your questions.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you to all three of you and the service that you give to the country on this. We do have lots of questions just about process and how things are going on this. Secretary Mayorkas, you and I have talked about Title 42 for about 18 months. And I've asked you the question, what happens when Title 42 goes away? And for 18 months, you've said, we're working on it. Well, Judge Sullivan just stepped in and unilaterally canceled out Title 42. So we're in this very odd situation right now where DHS is in one court asking to extend Title 42 a little longer, and in another court asking to cancel Title 42 altogether. But we're still waiting to try to figure out what happens now and how many people are about to cross the border. What's the plan for dealing with this mass migration and illegal immigration coming now post-Title 42?
Senator, what we requested of Judge Sullivan in the District Court of D.C. was an orderly wind-down period of 35 days, and which was unopposed and which was granted by the court. What we are doing is precisely what we announced we would do in April of this year, and we have indeed been executing on the plan. It's a six different lines of effort, and I will review them very, very quickly given the limited time. Surging resources to the southern border, including personnel, technology, facilities capabilities, and transportation, medical support. 2, increasing our Customs and Border Protection processing efficiency to mitigate potential overcrowding. We've been digitizing, for example, our electronic A files, the immigration files, when individuals are placed in proceedings. We are 3, enhancing the consequences for unlawful entry, especially with respect to individuals who seek to evade law enforcement, including removal, detention, and criminal prosecution when warranted. 4, we are seeking to bolster the capacity of nonprofit organizations, state and local officials, and working very closely with them. 5th, we are targeting and disrupting the smuggling organizations and the transnational criminal organizations. In fact, we have effected more than 5,000 arrests and more than 6,000 disruption events. And that means arrests of individuals, the breakdown of smuggling of stash houses, the seizure of the instrumentalities that these smuggling organizations use. And 6, we're working with our partners to the south to deter irregular migration. And I spoke earlier in response to Ranking Member Portman's question about the fact that this is a tremendous hemispheric challenge. We are seeing the movement of people and the demographics of the population that we are encountering at the border has changed dramatically.
Well, it has, and there's a couple of big challenges in this. One is the numbers just came in for October. It's the 3rd highest number in recorded history. So while those things were implemented, the numbers continue to accelerate, and this goes back to the estimates when Title 42 goes away. There was an expectation from Intel to be able to say these numbers will surge even greater. You built a Venezuelan policy on trying to be able to deter Venezuelans based on Title 42. That just went away. And so what we're trying to figure out is what is the plan, because the plan you just articulated has led to the 3rd highest number for any single month in history.
So there are a few points, if I may, Senator, and thank you. Number one, the number of encounters is not equal to the number of unique individuals.
Correct. Yeah, we know that. Yep.
Because Title 42 creates a potential for the ease of recidivism, number one. Number two, we're working with our partners to the south with Mexico with respect to the end of Title 42, and whether we will be able to continue our thus far successful program with respect to Venezuelan nationals and use our Title 8 authorities. But we also have other opportunities ahead of us because, as we sought to do earlier, and we will resume this effort, is an enhanced use of expedited removal, which is a Title 8 authority. So we're looking at our consequence regimes and how we can most effectively employ them.
A lot of people counting on these numbers coming down, and they're not. They're going up, and they continue to be able to rise. And so while we're examining these things and looking at it, the numbers continue to rise on this with the end of Title 42 coming in 35 days. We expect it's going to accelerate even higher. There is an expectation that your department is going to change this number dramatically. Let me ask a point-blank question that's challenging on this. What percentage of the individuals that are encountered at our southern border do we know their criminal history from the country they're coming from? I'm not talking about if they have an American criminal history or they're on our terror watch list, that we know their criminal history of the country they're coming from. Do we know that history?
I will have to get back to you on that, Senator, whether we have the capability of identifying the percentage, which is what you have.
It is my understanding that we don't know the criminal history of the vast majority. Can you give me an estimate on this? I'm not asking for a 0.8%, but give me a guess.
I understand. I'm quite hesitant to guess on information that is so important to our mission, but I will certainly get back to you with whatever information we can provide.
It is incredibly important because I think there's an assumption that the American people feel that the 2 million plus individuals that were encountered just in the last 12 months have been vetted in some way at our southern border or they've been checked. And we don't know if these individuals are fleeing poverty or fleeing from the law.
Oh, if I
We
may,
don't know. I mean, there is a check to see if they have an American criminal history record, but we don't know if they have a criminal history record or where they're coming from.
So as my colleagues here will attest as well, Senator, we conduct screening and vetting of individuals whom we encounter. We have a robust screening and vetting process. It actually is recurrent vetting, and it is not just with respect to criminal history in the United States.
I'd like to give in a good guess of how many people we know their criminal history when they come in then.
As I mentioned, Senator, I'll get back to you and see if we have that data, and if so, I will certainly provide it to you.
That would be great. Thank you. We have asked your team, and you and I have talked about it before, about the information for the NPP and the decision-making process for the Remain in Mexico policy on this. We asked about that for a while. We just recently got a letter back saying that there are no responsive documents that have been withheld. Basically, you have everything that we would have, but the implication then is the decision-making process of who qualifies for the MPP and who does not was left up to a case-by-case basis, and there are no guidance documents. I find that hard to believe, that there were no guidance documents given to anyone on your team anywhere along the border on how to be able to decide, yet your team is so far telling me, hey, we don't have anything. We never printed anything. I find that exceptionally hard to believe. I'd like to be able to follow up and be able to get access to those documents.
I look forward to discussing that with you because I certainly have some very important points to make in response to your concern.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Langford. Senator Scott, you're recognized for your questions.
First, Secretary Mayorkas, thanks for your calls around the hurricanes, and I've had a very positive experience with FEMA. So I think you have a great team there, and everybody there does a good job.
Thank you, Senator.
And I think the last time, Director Wray, you testified, I had the opportunity afterwards to go to West Virginia to see, and I think I would just want to compliment you on what you've done to revamp the call center operation. I know I'm sure it's still hard to catch everything that goes on out there, but I want to thank you for that. Secretary Mayorkas, you know that I've been disappointed at the border. It just seems like it's open. We've got all this fentanyl come across. We've got people dying. So, but here's my question, and I don't know, Secretary Mayorkas or Director Wray, if you want to answer it. It's been reported that the Chinese Communist Party are operating police stations in the United States in an effort to surveil Chinese dissidents. It seems obvious the U.S. shouldn't allow its most significant geopolitical rival, an oppressive communist regime, to establish police stations in the U.S. What authority or jurisdiction does the CCP have in the U.S.? And I don't know which one wanted to testify.
Well, Senator, like you, I'm very concerned about this. We are aware of the existence of these stations. I had to be careful about discussing our specific investigative work, but to me it is outrageous to think that the Chinese police would attempt to set up shop, in New York, let's say, without proper coordination. It violates sovereignty and circumvents standard judicial and law enforcement cooperation processes. And the reason this is so important is because we have seen a clear pattern of the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, exporting their repression right here into the U.S. And we've had now a number of indictments that you may have seen of the Chinese engaging in uncoordinated quote-unquote law enforcement action right here in the United States, harassing, stalking, surveilling, blackmailing people who they just don't like or who disagree with the Xi regime. And so it's a real problem, and it's something that we're talking with our foreign partners about as well, because we're not the only country where this has occurred.
They don't have any right to be here, right?
Well, we're looking into the legal parameters of it. So I want to be a little bit careful not to get out over my skis on that. But suffice to say, I can tell you from an FBI director perspective, I'm deeply concerned about this, and I'm not going to just let it lie.
Okay. Secretary, does it impact Homeland Security at all?
Well, of course, the threat of China is one of the most significant threats that we face in the Homeland. It's not only a matter of national security, it's a matter of Homeland Security in a number of arrays, in a number of areas of our mission.
Do you think you have the ability to shut them down? Do you know if you have the right to shut them down?
I would have to defer to the Department of Justice with respect to the
It would go to
legal
Justice,
authorities.
not Homeland Security? Okay. So it would be under FBI?
Well, or to the extent that the remedies might be some part of the Justice Department outside the FBI, that could also be a possibility. And then there may be a State Department dimension to this that we're looking into.
So when you know they're here, do you know if they're surveilling U.S. citizens? Do you know that yet? Do you have enough information to know if they are?
Well, again, I don't want to get too far into our ongoing investigative work, but as I said, we have seen plenty of situations in the past where the Chinese government, under the pretext of going after corruption, have essentially used that as a vehicle to surveil. We've had situations where they've planted bugs inside Americans' cars, for example. And one of the things that we're seeing more and more is them hiring private investigators here in the U.S. to essentially be their agents, if you will, to conduct some of this work. So this is something we're trying to call out, and it's important that Chinese Americans and Chinese dissidents who are here know to call the FBI to report when they think they may have been targeted with this conduct.
Could you, because you probably can't talk about it in here, I'd like to get a classified briefing on what they're doing, so at some point, so whenever it works out for you guys.
We'd be happy to set that up.
So, Director Wray, so what I'm asking you to tell me if it's accurate or not, so I'm not suggesting that all this is accurate. But it appears that DOJ have become politicized with regard to pro-life things. So there's a recent rise in high-profile FBI investigations of pro-life Americans, which raises the current concern that the FBI is weaponizing federal law enforcement and has become a tool, a partisan tool, which I don't think when we've talked that's been your goal. So there appears to be investigations that arrest of the pro-life community, and it's just the opposite of what's happened. We've had numerous firebombings, violent attacks, acts of vandalism against churches, pro-life organizations, and crisis pregnancy centers in the days following the leaks of the Dobbs opinion. So is this right? Is that happening, not happening?
Well, first let me say I firmly believe that the FBI is going about its work and doing the right thing in the right way. Now, I'm glad you raised this topic because it gives me an opportunity to speak to it. We have our view, my view, plainly expressed to all of our people, including in the context of abortion-related violence, is that I don't care what side of the issue you're on, you don't get to engage in violence. And we are equal opportunity when it comes to that. Now, we have quite a number of investigations as we speak into attacks or threats against pregnancy resource centers, faith-based organizations, and other pro-life organizations. And you might be interested to know that since the Dobbs Act decision, probably in the neighborhood of 70% of our abortion-related violence cases or threats cases are cases of violence or threats against pro-life. So where the victims are pro-life organizations. And we're going after that through our joint terrorism task forces, through our criminal authorities, FACE Act and things like that. We have about 20 field offices involved in this. And so we take it very seriously. And again, I don't care whether you're motivated by pro-life views or pro-choice views, you don't get to use violence to express it.
So we've talked about this before. It just seems to me that in DOJ, FBI in particular, they might be doing the right thing, but you guys allow information to go out that not talk about what you're doing. Because if you read the press, you would think that you guys are only going after pro-life groups and not going after groups that attack pro-life. So I've never understood this about the FBI and DOJ, in that you guys are more proactive about what you're actually doing. Because I'm pro-law enforcement, as you know, but I can't defend you with no information.
Senator, I think we don't have the time for me to tell you how frustrated I sometimes get by some of the news reporting about our work and the misreporting about our work. The circumspection that we display with regard to discussing our investigations is based on rules and practices that are important to people having confidence in the integrity of our work and go back decades in multiple administrations. And sometimes it can be very frustrating to agents on the ground when they see things being misreported about their work. But we have all been taught that we have to bite our lips and let the facts come out in the right way through court proceedings. And sometimes that can be very frustrating to us, and it sounds like to you too.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Scott.
Can I just finish something?
We'll have a second round, but real quick.
I just want to say, it makes it hard for us, right? Because people come to us saying, oh yeah, they must have done that. So,
Thank you, Senator Scott. Senator Hawley is deferred to Senator Romney. Senator Romney, you are recognized for your question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator Hawley. I appreciate the chance to be able to ask a few questions. Director Wray, I begin by saying how much I appreciate the work of your agents and how much I respect them and how convinced I'm of their quality. One of my sons years ago interviewed to become a member of the FBI. He was turned down. He was able to go on and get a degree at Harvard Business School and has done quite well, so he survived. But we learned from that experience that the qualifications for getting into the FBI are high indeed, as they should be. And I have great respect for the men and women who work for the FBI. There is a great deal of discussion about the political orientation of the FBI. My experience with your organization is that is not the case by and large. I'm sure there are individuals among the 38,000 who work with you who have political points of view, may leak things and may do things from time to time that are not appropriate, and I hope that you're able to evaluate them and evaluate where those come from and correct them. Can you give us a sense of how the resources of the FBI are directed? How much goes into looking at violent crimes of various kinds and human trafficking? How much goes into terrorist-related prevention? The kinds of, are there categories of effort that are carried out? Because I think there's a public perception that the whole FBI, we had to defund it because it's only doing political work. What is the FBI doing? Where are the resources devoted?
So if you were to look at our allocation of resources, and I can't give you the numbers off the top of my head, but if you were to look at the allocation of our resources, you would see that the single largest chunk is devoted to traditional criminal programs, and of which the violent crime is by far and away the biggest. And we have safe streets task forces all over the country. We have transnational organized crime task forces all over the country. We have violent crimes against children task forces. So those remain our bread and butter. Those remain our biggest programs. We do have unique responsibility for national security threats as well. And so if you were to look at our strategy, you might see the national security threats listed first because those are places where if we don't do it, no one will, right? Whereas violent crime, crimes against children, we work much more, you know, shoulder to shoulder with our state and local law enforcement partners. So a lot of times those national security threats, terrorism, counterintelligence work, cybercrime, get most of the, to Senator Scott's point, the media attention. But in, day out, the FBI that most Americans and certainly most law enforcement professionals who, and I talk to chiefs and sheriffs every week, the FBI they experience most is really more focused on the traditional criminal stuff.
Yeah, thank you. You've spoken a great deal about the cyber attacks from state actors from China as well as non-state actors. Secretary Mayorkas has spoken about that as well. I don't know that it's possible to, through a process of defending against attacks, to prevent all the potential attacks and all the theft that will come from our businesses and into our government. It strikes me that the only effective way to stop the attacks that come from of a cyber nature is to attack back, that the best defense is a good offense. And I know your respective organizations are not responsible for the offensive side of this, but to get China to stop attacking, they've got all these private enterprises that are doing these attacks into our systems. Fighting against all these things will never stop it unless China recognizes that if they don't stop it, that they're going to be hurt more than we are. Do you believe we have a sufficient effort in an offensive effort to push back against the cyber attacks that come from state and non-state actors, and should we expand on that, and where should that reside? And I'll ask both Director Wray as well as Secretary Mayorkas and Director Abizaid to respond.
So certainly when it comes to offense, offense is a critical part of our overall effort to push back against cyber adversaries. In addition to some of the offensive cyber operations that we probably couldn't, talk about in this kind of setting, there's actually a lot of progress being made in what I obliquely referred to earlier as joint sequenced operations, where we, with our partners, intelligence community partners, law enforcement partners, foreign partners, go with the whole 2 + 2 to make 5 kind of effect. So we're going after the adversary's infrastructure, we're going after their cryptocurrency, we're going after the individual actors. Some of them we can extradite, some of them we can have charged there. We're engaging in other sort of more sensitive counterintelligence type work to amplify those effects. But what we have found is that when we go after the actors, the infrastructure, and the money all simultaneously, we can degrade and disrupt their effectiveness. It is, I think that is really ultimately the real goal, is to degrade, disrupt, and defend in that way. In some ways, the deterrence model is harder. Much the same way we're not going to deter the Chinese or the Russians from spying, but we can make it hellishly difficult for them to do it. And that's what we're after now, is imposing risks and consequences on the adversaries to hit them where it hurts, to make it harder and harder for them to really come after us with cyber means.
Thank you.
If I may, Senator, add a point, because of course I don't need to speak of the criticality of a strong defense, and you are of course focused on, offensive behavior. A few weeks ago, I was in Singapore to speak to our allies in the Indo-Pacific region about the importance, or I should say, the peril of having China own or operate other nations' critical infrastructure, and the perils it presents from a cybersecurity and other security perspectives. And it was a very important dialogue, not only with our Singaporean partners, our Japanese partners, but other countries in the region, because China is very aggressive in seeking to own or operate the infrastructure in telecommunications and other technologies.
Yeah. Thank you. Director, yes.
Senator, I would just say, I'll defer to my colleagues on the cyber-specific piece of your question, but what I would say from a counterterrorism community perspective, there's so much that we have learned as a collaborative community about both offense and defense at the same time, that those lessons learned applied to things like transnational organized crime or cyber threats, I think really position us well as a government to take it to the threat actors.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Romney. Senator Hawley, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to the witnesses for being here. Director Wray, let me start with you if I could. I think the last time that I got to visit with you was back in August 4th of this year, you were at the Senate Judiciary Committee. You remember that, I assume. We had to cut that hearing short. We were supposed to do 2 rounds of questions. You said you had to be somewhere, so we cut it short. Republicans were not able to ask a second round as we had been informed we would. The press reported shortly thereafter that the reason that the hearing had to be cut short is because you were flying on a Gulfstream jet for a personal vacation in the Adirondacks. Please tell me that's not accurate.
Senator, the hearing was not cut short from my experience. We had agreed beforehand on the time and length of it, and I was very surprised to find that anyone on the committee was surprised. As to how I fly, I am required, not only permitted, but required to fly on an FBI plane wherever I go. That's
so you were going on vacation?
I was, yes.
So you left a statutorily required oversight hearing in order to go on a personal vacation in the Adirondacks?
I took a flight to go visit my family, as had been previously arranged in conjunction with the leadership of the committee.
The ranking member, Chuck Grassley, asked you during the hearing, he said, I assume you must have other business. You said, yes. He then said, if you have a business trip, you've got your own plane, can't it wait a while? He then said, Chuck Grassley, we only just heard half an hour ago that now you have to leave. We were going to have a 7-minute round followed by a 3-minute round. I've got 7 people on my side of the aisle, that included me, who are waiting for this additional round. Is there any reason we can't accommodate them for 21 minutes? And you said you had a plane to catch. You had somewhere to go. And now we find out it was for vacation?
The reference to other business was not a reference to that day. It was a reference to the following week where Senator Grassley and I were going to see each other in Iowa when I had other business in Iowa, and I did, in fact, see him then.
So wait, you had to leave the hearing early because you're going to see him later in Iowa in a week?
No, I had to leave when I said I was going to have to leave, as had been previously organized with the leadership of the committee.
You left an oversight hearing before the Senate Judiciary Committee required by statute so you could vacation with your family. I find that absolutely unbelievable and, frankly, indefensible. Now, is it your practice to use government planes? You say you do this all the time. You flew in a Gulfstream 550, I think, that was originally purchased for counterterrorism purposes. You were using it to go to, what is it, Saranac Lake? Is that how I say it? I've never been there. Is that the right pronunciation? Saranac Lake? That was your destination?
Yes.
So, did you enjoy the flight? I mean, did you pay for it?
Yes, I paid for it.
Will you turn over all receipts and reimbursement to this committee?
Senator, we will be happy to comply with oversight requests related to the use of the plane, as I said, and it's important for people to understand.
Why don't you just give me a yes? Will you turn over the receipts for your flight?
I will turn over the information related to my use of the plane. The use of the plane, I am required, not just permitted, required, even for personal travel, to use the FBI plane.
How convenient for you.
And I pay every single time that I use the plane for personal use.
I'm glad it's available for you to jet away from your statutorily required hearings and oversight before this Congress, where you denied the ability of members of Congress to ask you questions because you had to go on a personal vacation using a government plane. Let's just look at some of the things while you've been vacationing that your FBI has been doing. According to numerous whistleblowers who have come forward to members of this body, to members of the House, the FBI has been sending more than, in one instance, a dozen armed agents to a rural Pennsylvania home of a Catholic pro-life demonstrator to arrest him at gunpoint in front of his children in early morning hours, despite the fact that he posed no risk of violence or threat and had previously offered to turn himself in. Numerous whistleblowers, field agents, have alleged that D.C., your headquarters, has pulled them off working on child sex abuse cases, working on human trafficking cases, in order to work on January 6th matters for this reason, to give the appearance, they say, that there are hundreds of new domestic terrorism cases in the country, when in fact there are not. Whistleblowers, field agents have also said that D.C. has ordered the use of SWAT teams on nonviolent suspects who may have attended a January 6th rally, and they have been ordered to conduct surveillance and knock on doors of people who were not even in D.C. on January 6th. And again, all of this, according to the whistleblowers, these are your agents, all of this in order to make it look as if there's a mass surge in domestic terrorism all across the country, when in fact, the stats are being padded by political directive in your office. They also say, these whistleblowers, the DC leadership deliberately suppressed investigations into Hunter Biden, contrary to FBI procedure, and have also retaliated against FBI agents and whistleblowers who have contacted Congress, which, by the way, they are protected by statute to do so. This is what's happening at your FBI while you are evading oversight hearings. Mr. Director, do you think you're still up to this job?
I absolutely think I'm still up to this job, and I think our workforce feels the same way.
Well, I don't. And frankly, I think you should have been gone a long time ago. And given your behavior recently, I think it only makes it more clear. Are there any travel plans today that we should be aware of that you have? We're supposed to have a second round. Will you be here for that?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hawley. Senator Rosen, you're recognized for your questions.
There we go. Thank you. Thank you all for being here today. Appreciate it. I wanted to thank DHS, before I get started with my questions, for extending TPS to several countries last week. It's going to provide critical relief to thousands of families in Nevada. Those families appreciate that very much. And we do know that Congress must take action to enact immigration reform that both secures our borders and provides a path to citizenship for TPS recipients, dreamers, and others. But as we work towards this goal, I do appreciate, and the families in Nevada appreciate your consideration. And so I'm going to turn now to the topic of the hearing, threats to the homeland. Difficult subject, again, like all things here, but rising anti-Semitism. Every day in every way, we see more and more attacks, outbreaks of anti-Semitism here in the United States. The recorded incidents nationwide, I believe they're at an all-time high. Not a day goes by without another report of an anti-Semitic hate crime or prominent individuals inciting anti-Jewish conspiracy theories. With Jewish communities around the world facing increasing discrimination as well as threats and acts of violence, a whole-of-government approach is needed to effectively address anti-Semitism. Because many individual agencies play a critical role in combating anti-Semitism, we need closer interagency coordination to share best practices, share that ever-important data that keeps us safer when we share it, that intelligence, the same thing, identify gaps in our efforts between agencies, and streamline overlapping activities and roles so that we can best combat anti-Semitism where we see it, and I believe execute a unified national strategy. So, Secretary Mayorkas, how is DHS coordinating with other federal agencies in the fight against anti-Semitism? Would you support the development of a national strategy that uses a whole-of-government approach, cohesive, comprehensive approach to address this rising threat for all of us?
Senator Rosen, thank you. I think Director Wray spoke very powerfully, but a couple weeks ago, I believe it was in New York City, about the rise in anti-Semitism, and of course where we become involved in the Department of Homeland Security is the connectivity between an ideology of hate, regardless of the ideology in particular, and violence. That is where we become involved, and we are working very, very closely with the FBI and our federal, state, local, tribal, territorial, campus law enforcement partners to address violence, an increasing level of violence born of ideologies of hate, and quite clearly anti-Semitism is one of the rising ones, and it was at a high level to begin with. We are very grateful for your and this committee's support of the Nonprofit Security Grant Program. We are seeking in the fiscal year 2023 budget an increase from $250 to $360 million. That assists religious institutions, faith-based institutions, and other nonprofit organizations to really raise their level of security in response to increasing violence born of hate. The FBI and the Department of Homeland Security have published an unprecedented number of alerts and bulletins to our local state law enforcement personnel about an increasing threat level born of ideologies of hate.
So you would support a national strategy to combat anti-Semitism?
I would.
Thank you. Director Wray, I want to move over to you because I know that the FBI, as you've stated, found anti-Semitic hate crimes rose by 6% in 2020. It represents the highest total in 12 years. It constitutes 60% of all incidents based on religion. And in your estimation, your research and data, what it's telling you, what is driving this alarming trend? How is the FBI working with communities, state and local law enforcement, again, to be sure we're coordinating, and would you support a national strategy to combat anti-Semitism?
Well, taking the last part first, certainly I would support a national strategy. Second, the percentage is even worse than you summarized. I think it's 63% of all religiously motivated violent extremism incidents are motivated by anti-Semitism, and that's against a population that is only 2.4, I think, % of the American public. So it's pretty stark. And from our perspective, we see the Jewish community getting it from all sides, which may contribute to what's driving it, because not only have they long been a target of foreign terrorist organizations, and we've disrupted attacks by foreign terrorist organizations and foreign-inspired violent extremists against synagogues, for example. But then in addition to that, they're, of course, the target of domestic violent extremists. And as you may remember, we've disrupted an attempt to blow up a synagogue in the Las Vegas area just a couple of years ago, for example. So we're trying to tackle it both through the domestic terrorism lens, through our joint terrorism task forces, and through the hate crime lens through our civil rights program. And we created a domestic terrorism hate crimes fusion cell, which brings those two things together to ensure that we're pushing out information to our partners, whether it's at DHS or state local law enforcement or the community, and particularly the Jewish community, to be better able to anticipate what might be coming and prevent attacks.
Well, that's good. It really goes to my next question, because we do believe that hate crimes are vastly underreported because of fear sometimes, right? And since the enactment of the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act last year, do you feel that there's been an improvement in local and state law enforcement reporting hate crimes to the FBI and just reporting in general? Or how are you, is that been helping us?
Well, two things. One, I think overall reporting of hate crimes has gone up. And frankly, the Jewish community has been ahead of other communities that are victims in reporting historically. So we have been trying to preach the importance of reporting, and we have seen reporting coming up. The only caveat I would put on that is that we are in the midst of a multi-year transition to a different crime statistics reporting mechanism that's been anticipated for about a decade, I think. And so this particular year, the number may be somewhat flawed in terms of, or underreported in terms of the record keeping, just because of the transition that some police departments are making over from the old system to the new system. But as I would expect, as we go forward next year and beyond, it'll get back to being more comprehensive, and I fully expect it to show exactly what you're saying, which is that the hate crimes are on the rise.
Well, the analyst in me hopes that everyone who's converting to this is all using the same algorithm, so we have good reports. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. Senator Sinema, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before I begin, I want to express my sorrow with the news from Puerto Rico today. Air and Marine operations agents perform a very dangerous job with honor and integrity, and my thoughts are with our injured agents and their families, the family of the deceased agent, and all of Air and Marine operations. News like this today underscores why our work and our oversight is so important, and we owe it to our agents and our officers to do our part to secure the border and keep our communities safe. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. Fiscal year 2022 saw a record number of encounters at our southwest border, over 2.3 million individuals. While just under half of these migrants were removed under Title 42 authorities, the current system had multiple points of failure throughout the summer. In Arizona, local governments were forced to step in to provide emergency support to avoid street releases and have reassigned staff from other important roles to help manage the release of migrants from CBP custody. Border areas outside of Arizona have seen significant street releases, some coming in recent weeks. These releases directly onto city streets are inhumane and leave migrants vulnerable to the elements and bad actors intent on preying upon the most vulnerable. So the administration's continued failures on the border places Arizona communities and our nation's security at risk. The ongoing influx of migrants puts serious strain on our CBP resources, and it forces our Border Patrol agents out of the field and into processing and administrative roles. With the sudden announcement that Title 42 will be terminated in December, I'm extremely worried that DHS is not ready and that border communities and migrants will suffer the costs for this lack of preparation. It's obvious that the current strategy being implemented at our southwest border is not working and that change is necessary. Secretary Mayorkas, thank you for being here today. These current levels of migration are unprecedented. Following the D.C. Circuit's recent ruling regarding Title 42, Arizonans are concerned that we'll soon see these numbers surge even higher, and we need to send a clear message to potential migrants that we will be fair and humane, but we will secure our border and enforce our laws. Given the recent developments regarding Title 42, do you have a plan to ensure that those who enter without inspection are facing swifter and more certain consequences?
We do, Senator, and at the outset, thank you very much for recognizing the tragedy that our air and marine operations personnel within CBP suffered off the coast of Puerto Rico, and we pray for the family of the officer who lost his life, and we pray for the swift recovery of those who have been injured. We do have a plan, and I think there are a number of examples. One is how we've approached the increased number of encounters of Venezuelan nationals by building a lawful pathway for them to arrive safely in an orderly way in the United States, should they qualify and should they pass through our screening and vetting, and to deliver a consequence regime should they not avail themselves of that lawful pathway. The asylum rule that we have promulgated is a way of taking a broken asylum system, and we're grateful for your bipartisan work with Senator Cornyn in your proposed bill as a starting point to fix a broken asylum system. But we promulgated a regulation in the absence of much-needed legislation to fix the system, which takes a 6 to 8 year asylum period, which is just unmanageable, and reduces it potentially to under a year, which is going to change the migratory patterns of individuals seeking asylum in this country. Also, with respect to the fact that you mentioned that Border Patrol agents have not been out in the field, we've actually surged resources to the southern border, not only from different parts of our department, but contract personnel, an incredible number of contract personnel, so that we can get those agents out in the field doing what they swore to uphold, which is the detection and interdiction of individuals to enhance their swift removal should they not qualify for relief, and their ability to remain in the United States should the law so permit.
Thank you. Secretary, according to data from the Executive Office for Immigration Review, in fiscal year 2022, over 20% of initial cases were completed with an in absentia removal order. While that's a steep decline from the 50% mark that we reached in fiscal year 2020, that number is still far too high. So in order for our immigration system to function, we must ensure that individuals who refuse to comply with our immigration laws and are ordered removed from the United States actually experience that enhanced consequence regime. So how is DHS planning to ensure that people who willfully defy our immigration process are promptly removed from the country?
Senator, I would say two things. Number one, the data evidences quite powerfully that individuals who are represented by counsel have a much higher appearance rate in the immigration enforcement proceedings that we commence. The immigration system is extraordinarily complex, and we're dealing with vulnerable populations without counsel. Number one. Number two, we've expanded our alternatives to detention and technologized our ability to keep track of individuals, not just by the rather primitive ankle bracelets, but by phone, a phone system that does not allow people to make calls. It's not a phone operable in that sense, but actually that enables us to keep track and make sure that they're checking in with us. So the expansion of the alternatives to detention is an effort that we have very well underway.
My Bipartisan Border Solutions Act, which you just referenced and of course highlighted in our budget hearing earlier this year, creates regional processing centers across the U.S. And these centers would co-locate offices and agencies that play a role in the asylum process, which would enhance the processing of migrants seeking asylum to the U.S. I believe that these centers are key to any reforms intended to limit the strain currently placed on DHS. As introduced, the text placed Border Patrol in charge of detention. But this year, as noted earlier, we've seen additional agents being pulled out of the field due to processing needs, which has limited some of the operational control. Which DHS component would be best suited to take over the responsibility of those processing centers?
Senator, your bipartisan bill with Senator Cornyn is a very important start to fix a broken asylum system. I'd want to study actually which personnel would be best suited. Our goal is to make sure that our Border Patrol agents are out in the field doing the work that they signed up to do, and that, frankly, they are funded to do. We have made tremendous strides in getting them out in the field. This is a problem that arose last year, given the increase in the number of encounters. We really have made tremendous strides, and I could provide specific data. But with respect to your detailed question, I'd want to study the profile of the individuals that should maintain the custody of migrants encountered and placed in those processing centers at the border.
Mr. Chairman, I know that my time's expired. May I ask one quick follow-up question?
We do have a second round, but it'll be real quick.
Thanks. I've heard concerns that some of the timelines in the bill that Cornyn and I introduced may be too restrictive. So now that you've had some time to implement the asylum processing rule, we'd like to get your feedback on what a more feasible timeline would be in which credible fear interviews could be performed.
We'd be pleased to provide that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Sinema. We have, for the purpose for our witnesses to know, we have one, perhaps two senators to finish up the first round. Then we'll take a 5-minute break to allow you to stretch your legs a little bit, and then we'll be back for the second round. Senator Padilla, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here today. First question is going to be for Secretary Mayorkas. As you recall, Mr. Secretary, last year expressed significant concerns about the critical incident teams with Customs and Border Protection and their involvement with internal investigations of CBP agents. Now, these units, as we understand, have operated since 1987, but their investigations were never authorized because they're not legitimate federal criminal investigators, and their actions seem to shield CBP agents from liability. So I was pleased to hear that Commissioner Magnus issued a directive to end the use of critical incident teams by the end of the fiscal year prior to his resignation. However, the existence of such an entity for over 3 decades is disturbing and undermines the transparency needed with the nation's largest law enforcement agency. So I hope you share my concerns regarding the need to protect the integrity of DHS and all its components. Do you agree that there is no place for shadow police units within Customs and Border Patrol? And can you speak to any of the efforts that the department has taken to ensure that entities similar to the critical incident teams are not reestablished?
Senator, there's no place for a shadow investigative authority in any part of the department or any part of the government. And what we have done is actually commenced a wholesale review department-wide of our investigative discipline and accountability processes.
So, and how's the status of the termination or phase out as the commissioner?
I will check and get back to you with respect to the status of their termination.
Please do, please do. Next question is both for you and Director Wray. Earlier this year, the department released a report that detailed the need for improvements to information sharing as a means to addressing violent extremist activity. Mr. Secretary, I was pleased to see that your agency planned to develop a central case management system and information sharing mechanism for investigating allegations. Can you provide an update on where DHS is with these developments and whether there's been any significant roadblocks?
Senator, I'm not aware of any significant roadblocks, and in partnership with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, we have promulgated more products, more information sharing products than I can remember for the Department of Homeland Security in the many years that I've been there. The NTAS bulletin, other more or less formal bulletins and alerts to our state and local tribal territorial campus partners. We have really built a very cohesive operation in disseminating threat information throughout the country to really ensure that our local communities are aware of the threat information and law enforcement is able to prevent it to the best of its capabilities.
Okay. Director Wray, the Department of Justice similarly responded to President Biden's national strategy for countering domestic terrorism by highlighting the changes it would make to improve information sharing with state, local, tribal, and territorial partners as well. What specific changes have been made at the FBI to eliminate any gaps in information sharing?
So I think we engage in information sharing on this with state and local partners in two principal ways. The biggest one being through our joint terrorism task forces, where we have lots of state and local law enforcement agencies as task force officers on those task forces. One of the things that we've done over the last little while now is improve the amount of training that we provide to participants on those task forces and to state and local agencies more broadly about indicators of violence, indicators of mobilization to violence, symbology, iconography, things like that, to put them in a better position to be the eyes and ears that we need them to be, and then have information flow kind of in a virtuous cycle back with us. So that would be one of the things that I mentioned. Obviously, the bulletins that Secretary Mayorkas referenced is as a product of great work between the FBI and Department of Homeland Security to share information, and including with the fusion centers, which is a very important piece of the information sharing infrastructure, if you will, that exists in this country.
Yeah. And just in that spirit, I mean, the couple of the most critical areas in which to apply improved information sharing is when it comes to combating gun violence and domestic terrorism. According to a joint report issued in May of last year, the FBI and DHS determined that the greatest domestic terrorism threat is posed by lone offenders who are radicalized online and who look to attack soft targets with easily accessible weapons. Sadly, we've seen too many instances even since then. Highland Park, Uvalde, Buffalo, and even in my home state of California at the Geneva Presbyterian Church. The common thread here in each case was the ease with which the perpetrator acquired a weapon. Can you detail what steps are being taken by the Bureau to ensure that threats to our schools and places of worship and other important places are identified and neutralized?
So I guess there are a number of things that we do on that front. When it comes to schools specifically, we've been engaged in a very proactive outreach campaign to schools, done active shooter training, for example, at schools. Lots of our field offices meet with school officials in their areas of responsibility to help them identify better what to be on the lookout for. Because one of the things that we've learned in studying this issue over time when it comes to school shootings, for example, is that there's almost always somebody, a classmate, a teacher, a family member, someone who saw the transformation in the person, and that if they had known to speak up, known to report, it might have been preventable. And in those instances where we have successfully prevented a school shooting, for example, and those often don't get reported, but there are any number in which we have successfully prevented have always been because somebody in that situation did report. So we're trying to get the word out that way. Obviously, our NICS system which does the background checks to ensure that people who are legally prohibited from having firearms don't get them, is very active, processing background checks. And of course, with the recently passed legislation, there will be additional steps that we're taking to implement that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Padilla. Senator Ossoff, you're recognized for your questions. And after this question, we'll take a 5-minute break.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panelists for your service to the country and in national defense, defense of public safety. Director Wray, always a pleasure to see a fellow Georgian, and thank you for your continued service as well. Each time we've engaged in a setting like this one, I've asked you to assess the drivers of elevated levels of violent crime in Georgia and nationwide. According to FBI data, violent crime did increase from 2020 to 2021. Could you please provide the committee with an updated assessment of what is driving this dynamic?
So there are a lot of things driving the violent crime crisis that is occurring in this country, in Georgia and elsewhere. There are a few things. First, I would say the traditional drivers are all there: drugs, illegal gun trafficking, gangs, socioeconomic factors. So those are all still present. But in addition to that, we are seeing, and I hear this from chiefs and sheriffs all the time, as well as from our own agents, an alarming uptick in the incidence of juveniles engaging in violence, often graduating from carjackings to even worse violence. And that is a real challenge for the legal system because we're not set up to very effectively deal with crimes committed by minors. We are also seeing, not everywhere, but an awful lot of places, we are seeing way too many dangerous offenders getting back out on the streets. And the only thing more frustrating to the hardworking men of law enforcement than having to arrest somebody who should have been behind bars is having to arrest the same person over and over again. And that's a product of any number of things. It could be backlogs, it could be certain prosecution practices, certain kind of bail practices, and of course the juvenile issue that I mentioned. So those are some of the things that are driving it. In Georgia in particular, pretty much every week I feel like our Atlanta field office is engaging in some kind of operation where they're seizing drugs, guns, cash, whether it's meth, whether it's fentanyl. And so they're experiencing a lot of the same things that we're seeing nationally. Certainly neighborhood gangs are a big phenomenon in our home state. We are also seeing, I would add two other things that have a little bit of a Georgia wrinkle to it. One is juveniles who post-COVID have not returned to school, and so that may contribute to the juvenile effect. And we're seeing, violent criminals who are either detained or imprisoned because they're serving a sentence, who still have access to their cellular phones and are able to continue to participate in the activity despite best efforts by the corrections officials to continue to participate in the violent activity. So those are some of the things. And I guess one last one, an alarming phenomenon of switches which convert otherwise lawful weapons into fully automatic, and that, of course, increases the violent potential.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Director Wray. You have a new SAC in that Atlanta office, and welcomed her upon her arrival, wish her and her team the best. What can the FBI continue to do, and what more can you do to help protect communities in Georgia who are fearful that they may face carjacking or mugging or aggravated assault out on the sidewalk or at a shopping mall? What are you doing, and what more can you do? And will you continue to work with local law enforcement in Georgia to crack down on the violent crime that's preying on innocent citizens?
Violent crime is a major, major priority for the FBI. As I think I said in response to an earlier question, I still think it continues to be the place where we have the most single allocation of resources in terms of personnel. We have Safe Streets task forces that focus on sort of the gang violence. We have other kinds of violent crime task forces, all of which allow us to bring together what the FBI has to bear with state and local partners who participate on those task forces. We do active shooter training and things like that to help the community better protect itself. Our lab, close to half of the work that they do from a forensic side is in support of violent crime cases, often for our state and local partners. Senator Scott and I had a conversation about the tip line that we have out in West Virginia, where we prioritize getting threats to life out to state and local partners on the violent crime side. So there's a whole host of things that we're doing, but this remains top of mind for me and for my team. And when I am talking to chiefs and sheriffs, this is always the first topic we talk about and the last topic we talk about, because it's so much on everyone's mind.
Thank you, Director. Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us. Could you please assess the most significant threats to port infrastructure in the United States? Of course, we have in Georgia the Port of Savannah. It's the 4th busiest deep water port in the country.
With respect to the infrastructure itself?
Two ports.
Two ports. One of the concerns that we have is, of course, the cybersecurity threat to ports. We are increasing the level of technology by which our ports operate, and that is why not only does Customs and Border Protection have a focus on cybersecurity, but so does the United States Coast Guard. So I would identify, with respect to our ports, cybersecurity as a significant threat stream, and we're, of course, very focused on defending against it and strengthening our cybersecurity.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. And will you and your staff continue to work with the Georgia Ports Authority, state and local law enforcement in Georgia to help harden the Port of Savannah and other critical port infrastructure in Georgia against that threat and other threats?
We absolutely will, and you know, through the infrastructure bill that has been passed, fortunately, we have tremendous funding to dedicate to not only the improvement of the infrastructure itself, but also its hardening.
I want to close very briefly, Secretary Mayorkas. I thank you for your cooperation in providing to the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations the documents and records that allowed us to conduct an 18-month investigation of medical mistreatment of women in detention. We held that hearing, as you likely know, earlier this week. The bipartisan findings that Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin and I have presented are deeply disturbing and suggest there are major gaps in the vetting and oversight of DHS contracted physicians who treat the detainee population. I ask that you review those findings in detail and that we will have a follow-up engagement to discuss the steps that DHS is taking and needs to take to ensure that the dignity and human rights and constitutional rights of all detainees are upheld.
I look forward to doing so, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. To our witnesses, we've had you there for quite some time, so we're going to take a brief break. We'll come back for a second round for those senators who want a second round, but the time will be just 5 minutes in the second round. But let's take a recess for 5 minutes, and we'll reconvene. Committee will come back into order. Senator Ossoff, you're recognized for a second round.
Thank you for the extraordinary courtesy, Mr. Chairman, and welcome back to our panel. I'd like to begin, Director Wray, by requesting an update, to the extent you're able to provide details that'd be appreciated, on your efforts to defend historically black colleges and universities in Georgia and across the country from threats. Of course, threats have targeted Spelman College, other HBCUs in the state of Georgia. This is of deep concern to me and the whole community. Please provide the committee with an update on your efforts.
Well, Senator, certainly we share your concern. The fear and disruption that those threats have caused is utterly unconscionable. And this investigation, really I should say these investigations, plural, have been a priority for the FBI, including multiple field offices, joint terrorism task forces, et cetera. The update that I can give is that for the first tranche of the threats nationwide, the ones that generated probably the most initial media attention, if you will. There has been a recent development. An individual who's a juvenile, a little bit like the exchange that we had right before the break, has been identified, and because of the federal limitations on federal charging of juveniles for most relevant offenses, we've worked with state prosecutors on an unrelated state charge, which ensures restrictions and monitoring of the individual and disruption of his behavior. Now, that still leaves two other subsequent tranches of threats against historically black colleges and universities and other historically black religious institutions, for example, that we are still very much actively investigating, and because of that, there's not much I can share on those, but suffice to say, we got a lot of people working on this, and we're determined to see it through.
Thank you, Director Wray. Director Abizaid, haven't had the chance yet to ask you a question and would like to hear from you. What do you assess to be the most significant threats to the U.S. When it comes to transnational terrorism?
Well, so by far it's ISIS and Al-Qaeda in terms of transnational terrorism, though racially and ethnically motivated extremists also present a dramatic threat. You know, the hierarchically organized groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS are actually transitioning their way of attacking to lone actor type threats, inspired violence here in the United States homeland, and we see very similar trends in the racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists bucket of ideologically motivated threats as well.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. The authorization from the Office of Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction is set to expire next year. In preparation, Senator Portman and I introduced a bill that reauthorizes CWMD office and empowers the newly created Office of Health Security at DHS. The bill clarifies roles and responsibilities for both offices and adds important accountability and oversight measures. Secretary Mayorkas, could you explain to this committee how the expiration of the authorization for CWMD would impact it if it expires, and particularly how important the legislation is to deal with local, tribal, and territorial partners on this critical issue?
Mr. Chairman, the Office of Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction is of vital importance to the Department of Homeland Security. I think if we look back in time and we see the use of chemical weapons in Syria and the tragedies that inflicted on the people there, that's one powerful example, and we don't have to look that far back in history to understand the importance of the office. Just the fact that the potential, the specter of the use of nuclear weapons was discussed in public fora in light of Russia's unprovoked aggression against Ukraine speaks to the criticality of this office, and we do hope that the bipartisan bill that you have presented is passed. We need this office reauthorized.
Thank you, Secretary. Director Abizaid, how has the threat from weapons of mass destruction increased or decreased over the last 5 years?
The threat that terrorists would use WMD and particularly CBRN capabilities, I think, has been sustained over that 5-year time period, certainly.
Very good. Secretary Mayorkas, you ordered an internal review of at DHS after the tragic shootings in Buffalo and Uvalde to assess whether the department was effectively using its resources to address domestic terrorism and targeted violence. As a result of that review that you did, you announced the appointment of Nick Rasmussen as the full-time counterterrorism coordinator. What goals have you asked him to accomplish, and what's the time frame for him to achieve those goals?
Mr. Chairman, Nick Rasmussen comes with impeccable credentials to be this counterterrorism coordinator for the Department of Homeland Security. He used to be the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, and just a distinguished career. What I've asked him to do in the first instance is really take a look at our counterterrorism efforts across the department and make sure that we are being as impactful and effective as possible. One of the efforts that I have across the department in every mission set is to drive greater cohesion so that our impact is maximized. That is the first thing that I have asked him to take a look at, and I'm actually meeting with him in a few days to discuss the setting of a timeline and incremental goals along the way. And I look forward to discussing that with you.
Right, we'll look forward to that. Certainly, we do have to have a coordinator overseeing all this, so I appreciate the efforts that you're making in that area. The administration just released an updated strategy and implementation plan on countering biological threats. This new strategy implements recommendations learned from the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic and the monkeypox public health emergency. Certainly, global shortcomings in preparedness for the pandemic and biosecurity may inspire adversaries to develop and use biological weapons in the future, certainly a major concern for all of us. Secretary Mayorkas, could you discuss how DHS is working to implement the National Biodefense Strategy, and how has the creation of the Office of Health Security better aligned DHS efforts in this space?
Mr. Chairman, that strategy really speaks of a whole-of-society approach. It's not something that the federal government can do alone, but we need state and local partners and private citizens, nonprofit organizations, academia. So it's a very holistic, inclusive approach to the problem, and that is the approach that we are taking in the department through CWMD, the Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Office, the Office of Health Affairs, and importantly, our Office of Science and Technology with the research and development that it spearheads. And I'm grateful to this committee for really moving forward with the confirmation of Dmitry Kutsinov as our new Undersecretary for the Office of Science and Technology. So it's really a very all-of-society approach, and our leader of the Office of Health Affairs, our Chief Medical Officer, is a tremendous leader in identifying what are the greatest threats that are imminent or upon us and developing a strategy to address it. He was instrumental in our protocols to address COVID-19 in immigration detention centers along the southwest border, working with border communities to develop a real infrastructure to address that. And so we're taking a all-of-department approach in the context of an all-of-society approach that the strategy calls for.
Well, that's good. This committee will deal with this issue extensively over the next couple of years, so we'll look forward to working closely with your team to address the challenge and the threat. Senator Hawley, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks again to the witnesses for being here. Mr. Secretary, nice to see you. I didn't get to visit with you last time, so let's start with you. I think my colleagues have established, given what we're seeing on the southern border, the massive increase in illegality there, that's clearly not a priority for your agency. So let's talk about what appears to be, and that is spying on Americans and censoring their speech. You have turned your agency into a censorship machine. Now, you said earlier this year that you disbanded the Disinformation Governance Board, which I thought was totally unconstitutional, but that turns out to be, at best, misleading. That's just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what you're doing. Your own quadrennial review, which was just reported in the press, says that disinformation is going to be the new focus at DHS. The Quad Review says that DHS plans to target, I'm quoting now, inaccurate information domestically on a wide array of subjects, including, quoting, the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic, the efficacy of COVID-19 vaccines, racial justice, U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, and the nature of U.S. support for Ukraine. This is what you're devoting your agency's resources to. So I guess my first question is an American citizen who criticizes COVID mandates now to be treated as a domestic terrorist?
Of course not, and I'd like to say three things since you have three inaccuracies in the question you posed to me. Number one, border security is a priority of ours. Number two, the department does not censor speech. And number three, we did not publish a quadrennial review.
Does it exist, the quadrennial review?
I believe it is being worked on.
Well, it's been published in the media. Will you make it public?
When it is final, it will be public.
Mr. Chairman, without objection, I'd like to enter this article called "The Truth Cops," published in The Intercept. Here's my question then. If you're not censoring speech and if you're not treating Americans as domestic terrorists, then why is it that you're pressuring big tech to treat American citizens as if they're threats to the homeland? Why are you pressuring them to censor speech? Let's take a look at some new documents that have come to light that show what your administration is doing, this administration is doing to censor speech. Let's take a look at this email from July 16th, 2021. It's over my shoulder here. Facebook emailing HHS saying, I know our teams met today to better understand the scope of what the White House expects from us on misinformation going forward. Are you familiar with that email?
No.
Let's try another one.
And if I should...
How about, hold on, we'll get to that. But you're not familiar with this, all right. Let's try a different one. Here's one from July 20th, 2021. The White House emails Facebook saying, any way we can get this pulled down. 46 seconds later, Facebook responds, yep, we're on it. Are you familiar with that email?
No.
Okay, how about this one? July 23rd, 2021. Facebook employee writes to HHS, says, thank you for taking the time to meet today. Wanted to make sure you saw the steps we took just this past week to adjust policies and what we are removing with respect to misinformation. Are you familiar with that one?
Senator, we do not instruct.
Just yes or no.
No, because I'm the Secretary of DHS.
Well, I'm asking you that because it's funny you say that. A federal judge has just found as a finding of fact, Mr. Secretary, that your office, and I'm going to quote now, is supervising the nerve center of federally directed censorship. It's a federal judge in a federal lawsuit. You are supervising the nerve center of federally directed censorship. Here's another email, August 20th, 2021. Facebook writes again to HHS and highlights that Facebook is increasing the strength of our demotions for COVID and vaccine-related content. April 16th, 2021, Rob Flaherty at the White House circulates a Zoom meeting invitation to Twitter employees stating White House staff will be briefed by Twitter on vaccine misinformation. We have example after example of this administration coordinated, apparently, according to a federal court, by your agency, pressuring, coercing social media companies to engage in censorship. Is that constitutional?
That is unequivocally false.
Is what the emails show.
It is unequivocally false, Senator.
You are not pressuring the big tech companies to take down accounts. You are not meeting with them to ask them to censor on your behalf.
That is correct. We are not.
You're not having any meetings with them whatsoever.
We meet with the tech companies.
How often?
To address the Homeland Security mission.
How often do you meet with them?
For example, online child sexual exploitation is a scourge in this country, and we have an obligation to address it.
You're saying that no one in your office has ever met with, coordinated, or otherwise engaged in any contact with a social media company in which you spoke to them about vaccine mandates, about COVID mask mandates, about the withdrawal from Afghanistan, about the current U.S. involvement in Ukraine. None of that has ever happened.
I don't know what you're referring to, Senator, and I can
read the emails.
And I can tell you this: well, you've actually cited emails outside of our department, but if
I've cited a federal judge who says your department is engaged in supervising the nerve center of federally directed censorship. Here's my point, Mr. Secretary. It has been established for years in this country, as you very well know because you're a lawyer, that the federal government may not use private third parties to engage in activities that are unconstitutional. That's exactly what you and this administration are doing. You are leveraging private companies to carry out censorship on your behalf. It's dystopian, but worse than that, it's unconstitutional.
it's also false.
Thank you, Senator Hawley. Seeing no other senator here, I want to thank our witnesses once again for joining us today. We recognize that you all have very busy schedules, and we appreciate you joining us to help the committee better understand some of the most pressing security issues that our nation is facing. This committee will continue to work to address many of the issues that we discussed today. For example, as we heard today, the threat posed by drones is extremely serious, and we cannot let legislation that protects Americans from unmanned aircraft systems expire in December. I look forward to working with my colleagues here in the Senate and in the House to ensure that the federal government is effectively managing this threat. I will also continue to work with the Department and the FBI on improving the government's response to the threat posed by domestic violent extremism. I appreciate the administration's efforts to tackle this issue, but more can and must be done. Without a more data-driven approach to understand the threat, the government will continue to face challenges addressing this issue. I will also continue to press the administration on meeting mandatory congressional reporting requirements so that we can ensure the federal government has the authorities and the resources needed to help prevent deadly incidents like the tragic shooting in Buffalo from occurring again. And finally, as several members have done on behalf of everyone on this committee, I would like to express our sincere condolences on the absolutely tragic news of loss and injury to CBP air and marine operations agents. Each and every day throughout the pandemic, the frontline personnel of DHS have put their lives on the line to protect Americans from serious threats that we have discussed today, and we all thank them for their commitment. While we have spent several productive hours this morning examining our nation's greatest security threats, there's more work to do for our committee to continue conducting oversight and ensuring national security agencies are effectively focused on their critical mission. For the record, this hearing will remain open for 15 days until 5 p.m. on December 2nd, 2022 for the submission of statements and questions for the record. This hearing is now adjourned.